Welcome, listeners. You are about to immerse yourselves in a gripping mystery, meticulously crafted and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare yourself for an unforgettable journey through intrigue, deception, and the pursuit of truth. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Alchemist's Secret Formula. The cold mist of the early evening wrapped itself around 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps casting their dim light through the thickening fog. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of tobacco smoke and the faint aroma of tea. The steady tick of a clock echoed from the far corner of the room, each second lingering, as if aware that something momentous was about to happen. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, his fingers drumming absently on the armrest, his mind as sharp as ever, though his gaze was distant, lost in thought. Dr. John Watson, his ever-faithful companion, sat nearby, his brow furrowed in concentration as he perused the contents of a letter. The tranquility of the room was shattered by a sharp knock at the door, the sound cutting through the otherwise silent space. Watson looked up, his expression one of quiet curiosity. Holmes, without missing a beat, stood and walked to the door with his usual deliberate grace. He opened it to reveal a tall figure, cloaked in the shadows of the street outside. A man of considerable bearing, though his eyes revealed a clear anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, I am Lord Lionel Ravenscroft," the man introduced himself, his voice wavering despite his efforts to maintain composure. "I require your immediate assistance." Holmes's eyes, dark and calculating, took in the man's appearance, noting the tremble in his hands, the way his shoulders were stiff with the tension that underlined every movement. A man unused to such distress. Holmes nodded, his expression unchanged. "Come in, Lord Ravenscroft. Please sit." The Lord stepped inside, and with a flick of Holmes's hand, Watson stood to make room. He then took a seat, though his nervous energy remained evident as he clasped his hands in his lap. "My estate is in turmoil, Mr. Holmes," Ravenscroft began, his voice taut with a mix of fear and disbelief. "A crime has been committed, one that I believe is beyond the capabilities of the local constabulary to resolve. It involves a matter of great importance, a matter that I cannot fully explain without risking far-reaching consequences." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his piercing gaze never leaving the man before him. He motioned for the Lord to continue. "My grandfather's alchemical formula, Mr. Holmes. It was stolen." Holmes's brow arched ever so slightly, a faint but telling gesture that marked his interest. "Alchemical formula?" he repeated, his tone slow, deliberate, as though carefully weighing each word. "You refer to the formula believed to hold the key to eternal life?" Ravenscroft nodded, his face pale beneath the veneer of aristocratic composure. "Indeed. It has been in our family for generations, passed down through the years, though it had been kept in secret. My grandfather, the late Lord William Ravenscroft, was an alchemist of considerable repute. Only a handful of people were aware of its existence, and one of them, I suspect, has betrayed us." Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson, who, though clearly intrigued, remained quiet, his curiosity piqued by the cryptic nature of the case. "Where was this formula kept?" Holmes asked, his voice steady, his posture still. "In a secure room," Lord Ravenscroft replied. "In a safe, well protected, I assure you. And yet, this morning, when my staff arrived to retrieve a book from the study, they found the butler unconscious. He had been struck over the head and left for dead. The formula was gone, and with it, a part of our family's legacy." Watson leaned forward, his interest evident in the way his eyes sharpened. "And the butler?" he asked. "Recovering, though quite shaken. I fear the blow has left him with a slight amnesia. He recalls very little, save for a shadowy figure entering and exiting the study." Ravenscroft's voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Holmes, who had been listening intently, stood without a word. He moved across the room, his mind already working through the possibilities, piecing together fragments of information. His fingers touched the edge of the fireplace mantel, his gaze distant. Perhaps it was not the butler's fault, Holmes murmured, as if to himself, but an inside job nonetheless. He turned sharply, his eyes meeting Lord Ravenscroft's with an intensity that caused the man to flinch. Who else, apart from the staff, knew of the formula's location? Who else had access? The Lord shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands wringing together. Only a few. Myself, the butler, and... He hesitated, then sighed, the words heavy in the air. And Professor Johnson, a scholar of alchemical texts. He visited several times recently, seeking knowledge on my grandfather's works. Holmes nodded slowly, taking the information in. So we have a scholar involved as well, he mused. A man of intellect, and perhaps ambition. The note, Watson interjected, his voice rising slightly with curiosity. The one left behind in the study. What of it? Lord Ravenscroft reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of parchment, which he handed over to Holmes. This was found on the desk, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It simply read, "The Philosopher's Stone is in your grasp." Holmes unfolded the note, examining it closely. The faint trace of ink was old, though the words were sharp, as though the message had been penned with deliberate force. He paused, a flicker of realization crossing his face. He turned to Watson, his voice low, almost contemplative. A riddle, Watson. This note may be the key. The phrase, "the Philosopher's Stone," a well-known reference to the alchemical pursuit of immortality. Whoever wrote this is not simply after the formula for wealth. No, they seek something far more dangerous. Holmes handed the note back to Lord Ravenscroft, who looked on in stunned silence. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I am suggesting," Holmes replied, "that this theft is not just about a lost formula. It is about something far more sinister. The formula itself, in the wrong hands, could be deadly." He fixed the Lord with an unflinching gaze. "We must act quickly. The thief is not just after gold or riches, but something far more valuable, something that could change the very course of history." The room fell silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock, each second echoing like a countdown to a mystery that was only just beginning to unfold. The evening fog had thickened by the time Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson arrived at Ravenscroft Manor. The towering estate loomed in the distance, an imposing structure draped in shadows, its windows dark and forbidding. A chill had settled into the air, the dampness from the mist creeping into their bones as they stepped from the carriage and approached the front door, where a butler stood waiting, his face pallid and anxious. "I am at your service, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the butler greeted, his voice strained. "Please follow me. Lord Ravenscroft is most eager to speak with you." Holmes offered a curt nod, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with meticulous care as they were led into the grand foyer. The scent of polished wood and faint candle wax filled the air, mingling with the underlying scent of something else, something faintly acrid. Holmes's gaze lingered momentarily on the walls, which seemed to absorb the shadows, before he turned his attention to the butler. "You mentioned the theft of the alchemical formula," Holmes said, his voice deliberate. "I trust the security measures in place were adequate to prevent such an intrusion?" The butler nodded, though his eyes betrayed a deep discomfort. "Yes, sir. We believed the study was secure. No one knew the combination to the safe, except Lord Ravenscroft and myself. The formula was locked away in a hidden compartment behind the bookshelves." Holmes paused, his gaze drifting toward the grand staircase, its banister polished to a high sheen. "And yet the formula was taken," he observed quietly, a note of skepticism in his voice. "Tell me, where exactly did the theft occur?" "Inside the study," the butler replied, his hands nervously wringing together. "In the very room where the formula had been kept for years." Holmes turned toward Watson, who had been observing the exchange with a quiet intensity. Watson nodded, the lines on his face deepening as he processed the information. Holmes's mind was already working through the possibilities, each step leading them deeper into the mystery. Lord Ravenscroft, having heard their approach, emerged from a side door, his figure gaunt and pale, his eyes wide with anxiety. He gave a slight bow to Holmes and Watson before speaking. "I have instructed that the study be left undisturbed, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice strained. "Please, inspect the scene for yourself." Holmes wasted no time. With a quick glance at Watson, he strode toward the study, his footsteps measured and precise. The room was large, lined with towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling. A fireplace, now cold, sat in the far corner, its grate empty of any embers. On the desk, there were papers scattered in disarray, as though the room had been hastily searched. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the space, making it difficult to discern any clear details at first. Holmes's eyes flicked over the room with practiced ease, noting the small details that most would have missed. The slight indentations on the desk where a heavy object had been moved, the marks on the floor where the rug had been shifted, and the faint smell of something pungent, not unlike the scent of chemicals. He moved toward the bookshelves, his fingers brushing lightly against the spines, as though searching for something out of place. Watson, who had been observing Holmes's movements with rapt attention, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Sherlock, there seems to be nothing missing here. No sign of forced entry. Nothing of value appears to have been disturbed except—" He paused, noticing a peculiar object lying on the floor. Holmes followed Watson's gaze. There, lying partially concealed beneath the edge of the desk, was a small vial of liquid, its contents a faint, glowing blue. Holmes's fingers closed around it, lifting it from the ground with careful precision. "A curious item," Holmes remarked, his voice calm but laced with an underlying tension. "A chemical mixture of some sort, though its purpose eludes me." Watson leaned closer, his expression one of caution. "Do you think this could be related to the formula? Perhaps an ingredient or—" "Perhaps," Holmes interjected, turning the vial over in his hand. "But it is not the formula, nor is it the answer to this particular mystery." He paused, his eyes scanning the rest of the study once more. "This is, however, a clue." Lord Ravenscroft had followed them into the study, and now stood in the doorway, his hands wringing nervously. "What does it mean, Mr. Holmes? Is this all some elaborate ruse? Can you not solve the mystery?" Holmes turned his gaze upon the Lord, his expression unreadable. "The solution will not be found by following the obvious path, Lord Ravenscroft. It is far more intricate than that. We must look deeper." The Lord nodded, though his eyes betrayed a clear anxiety. "But who could have done such a thing? Who in my household would have taken the formula?" Holmes considered this carefully, his fingers gently tapping the edge of the vial as he thought. He glanced once more at the butler, who had been standing near the doorway, his eyes darting nervously between Holmes and Lord Ravenscroft. "Tell me," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Who else knew of the formula's location? Who had access to this room aside from yourself and the butler?" Ravenscroft shifted uncomfortably. "Aside from the staff, only Professor Johnson had been in this room recently. He is an expert in alchemy. He has been researching my grandfather's work for some time now." "Professor Johnson," Watson echoed, his voice tinged with curiosity. "And what of his interest in the formula?" Ravenscroft hesitated for a moment before answering. "He was fascinated by it. My grandfather had always been secretive, but the professor was relentless. He believed that the formula could unlock some great power. I feared he might be getting too close to something dangerous." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And did he know the exact location of the formula?" he asked, his voice low but filled with purpose. Ravenscroft nodded. "Yes, I told him. He had studied my grandfather's work extensively and knew about the hidden compartment behind the bookshelves. I trusted him." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. A scholar, with access to the formula's hiding place, and a potential motive driven by his own obsession with alchemical secrets. He stood straighter, his thoughts already turning toward the next steps in the investigation. We must find Professor Johnson. I believe he is the key to unlocking the truth behind this theft. Watson's gaze flicked toward the butler, still standing at the doorway, watching the exchange with a mixture of uncertainty and fear. Holmes turned toward him, his eyes probing. And you, sir, what of your involvement in this matter? Were you aware of the professor's interest in the formula? The butler flinched, his hands trembling slightly. No, sir, he replied quickly. I knew nothing of it. I am simply here to serve. Holmes didn't reply immediately. Instead, he turned to Ravenscroft, who stood rigid, his face drawn. Lord Ravenscroft, we will need to speak with Professor Johnson at once. If he is the one behind this, I suspect we will find him attempting to flee the country. The formula, it seems, is not merely a piece of academic interest. It is far more than that. The fog had grown heavier by the time Holmes and Watson arrived at the modest building tucked away in the heart of London's antiquarian district. The morning light barely filtered through the dense haze, and the streets were eerily quiet save for the occasional creak of the wood beneath their feet as they walked. Holmes, ever the focused investigator, led the way, his stride purposeful and steady, as if the mystery itself had already begun to reveal its hidden truths. Watson, trailing behind, was deep in thought, his mind turning over the troubling questions that had emerged the previous evening. You think Professor Johnson is the one behind all this, don't you? Watson asked quietly, his voice barely audible against the sound of their footsteps. Holmes did not break his pace. I do, he replied, his voice calm, but tinged with a quiet intensity. He has both the means and the motive. Access to the formula, obsession with its potential, and now, an opportunity for escape. Watson glanced toward the narrow shop fronts lining the street, noting how the shadows seemed to cling to the alleyways, thick and suffocating. But what of the butler? Could he have been involved in some way? His behavior is unsettling, to say the least. Holmes paused briefly, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. The butler is a curious figure, to be sure, but I sense no guilt in his actions. I suspect he is simply a pawn in a far larger game. They arrived at the door of an antiquarian bookshop, its windows fogged and dimly lit from within. Holmes knocked 3 times, each rap echoing through the silence. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a thin, elderly man with glasses perched on the end of his nose. His clothing was well worn but neatly pressed, and his hair, though thinning, was combed carefully to one side. Mr. Crawford, Holmes greeted, his tone polite but direct. We are here to speak with Professor Johnson. Is he in? The man's eyes flicked from Holmes to Watson, his gaze sharpening momentarily before he stepped aside to allow them in. Professor Johnson, he's not in today, but he was here not 2 hours ago, Mr. Crawford replied, his voice soft but tinged with a hint of unease. I haven't seen him much these last few days, and I must say, his visits have been increasingly erratic. Holmes raised an eyebrow, sensing a deeper layer to the man's words. Erratic, he repeated, stepping further into the shop. The shelves were crammed with old tomes and curiosities, the musty scent of paper and ink filling the air. The light from a solitary lamp illuminated the dust that clung to the air, making the room feel both ancient and alive. Mr. Crawford hesitated before responding. Yes, well, it's not my place to say, but I've noticed he's been asking about alchemical symbols, the kind of things one doesn't usually inquire about unless one has a particular interest. Holmes gave a small nod, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. What kind of symbols? Old ones, from medieval texts, Mr. Crawford replied, pulling a thin, leather-bound volume from one of the shelves. He seemed obsessed with them, though I told him those books weren't for sale. They're rare, you see. Holmes accepted the book, flipping through its pages with practiced speed, his fingers skimming over the delicate paper. The book was filled with diagrams of strange alchemical symbols, intricate drawings that hinted at forbidden knowledge. It was precisely the kind of text that someone obsessed with immortality might covet. He glanced up at Mr. Crawford, who appeared increasingly uncomfortable in the presence of the two men. "Did the professor mention anything specific regarding Lord Ravenscroft's formula?" Holmes asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. Mr. Crawford shifted uneasily. "He did, but in a roundabout way. He asked about alchemists who had gone to great lengths to discover the secrets of eternal life, and then he started speaking about a formula, a powerful one, though he never directly stated it was the Ravenscroft formula. But I couldn't help but think." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought he might be planning something more than just research." Holmes closed the book and returned it to the shelf, his eyes scanning the shop one last time. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Crawford," he said, his voice firm but polite. "Your observations have been most enlightening." Watson, who had been silent throughout the exchange, now spoke up. "So, we know that Johnson is not only interested in the formula, but he's also been actively researching alchemical symbols tied to immortality. Perhaps this is the missing link." Holmes nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But we must tread carefully, Watson. There is much more at play here than simple academic curiosity. Johnson's obsession may be far more dangerous than we first imagined." As the two men exited the shop, Holmes's mind continued to race, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with each passing moment. But as they walked down the street, the oppressive fog seemed to close in on them, thickening with each step, as if the very city was hiding something more, something darker. "Holmes," Watson began again, his voice heavy with thought, "are we certain that Johnson is the only one involved? The butler. His strange behaviour cannot be ignored. He must know something more." Holmes's gaze flicked toward the mist-laden streets. "Indeed, Watson, and I intend to find out what. But I fear we may be dealing with more than just a simple theft. The theft of an alchemical formula is no small matter. There are forces at play here that we do not yet fully understand." The conversation was interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps behind them. Holmes turned sharply, his eyes catching the figure of a man emerging from the fog, his face hidden in shadow. The stranger moved swiftly, purposefully, as if he were trying to avoid being seen. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low, "I believe we have company." The man quickened his pace, his steps quickening into a jog as he made his way toward a narrow alleyway on the left. Holmes's eyes flashed with recognition. "That is no ordinary passerby, Watson. We must follow him." Without waiting for a response, Holmes began to move with calculated speed, Watson close behind. As they pursued the stranger into the alley, the atmosphere grew tense, the shadows seemingly swallowing them whole. The fog had turned from a simple nuisance to a cloak that masked their every step. They turned a corner, and the figure was gone, vanished into the mist. Holmes stood still for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, his mind whirring as he pieced together the implications. "This is no coincidence," Holmes said softly, more to himself than to Watson. "Someone is watching us, Watson, and they are trying to lead us astray." The early morning light streamed weakly through the blinds of Sherlock Holmes's study, casting long, angled shadows across the floor. The fog that had consumed the city the previous night had dissipated, but an unsettling stillness lingered in the air. Holmes sat at his desk, his brow furrowed in deep thought, a half-formed theory swirling in his mind. He had spent the better part of the night piecing together the puzzle, but something was still missing, something that eluded his grasp. Watson, ever patient but equally intrigued, paced slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The investigation had been taxing, and the sense of unease that had gripped them both seemed to grow with each passing moment. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, there was a subtle excitement in the air, a feeling that they were on the cusp of something far more complex than a mere theft. "Holmes, do you think we are chasing shadows?" Watson asked, his voice quiet but tinged with frustration. "We have traced every lead, spoken to every possible source, yet the formula remains elusive, and the suspects seem to slip further from our grasp. How long do we pursue this before we accept the possibility that there is no one person to blame?" Holmes, who had been lost in thought, looked up at Watson, his expression unyielding. "We are not chasing shadows, Watson. The shadows are chasing us. There is something far darker at work here, something that is not yet fully revealed. Trust me, we are close." Watson's eyes narrowed, his skepticism still evident. "Close? How do you know?" Holmes stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the wooden floor. He walked over to the fireplace, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. "Because, Watson, the pieces are all connected. The butler, the professor, the formula itself. They are all part of a much larger design. And what's more, the thief has made a mistake." Watson raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" Holmes's gaze flickered toward the desk, where several notes and documents were scattered. His fingers hovered over one of them, a letter written in a hurried scrawl. He picked it up, holding it carefully as if it were fragile, then turned toward Watson, his expression one of quiet triumph. "Yes, a mistake," Holmes confirmed. "This letter, which I found among the professor's personal effects, contains the final clue. It is the key to everything." He handed the letter to Watson, who unfolded it carefully. The writing was crude, the ink blotched in places as if written in haste. Watson read aloud the contents, his voice steady, but his brow furrowed with confusion. "I know what you seek, and I can help you obtain it. Meet me at the old mill at dusk. The formula is incomplete, but together we can unlock its true power. J." Watson looked up from the letter, his eyes wide. "J? Who could this be? Could it be a second accomplice?" Holmes's expression was one of deep thought, his gaze fixed on the letter as if willing the answer to reveal itself. "Not an accomplice, Watson. A shadow. A figure we have yet to identify." He paused, the quiet intensity of his voice underscoring the gravity of his words. "It is clear now that Professor Johnson is not working alone. He has a collaborator, someone who shares his obsession with the formula, someone who believes that the power contained within it is worth far more than simple riches." Watson's face shifted as the realization set in. "But the formula, it's incomplete. Even if they were to obtain it, there would be no immortality, no guarantee of success." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes darkening with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Precisely. But therein lies the heart of the matter. The formula's incompleteness is not an obstacle. It is the very lure that has drawn them in. It is the promise of something greater that they cannot resist." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of the discovery hung in the air. Watson, though still uneasy, seemed to grasp the enormity of the situation. "So, they are chasing a myth, a false hope." Holmes's gaze softened, but his expression remained focused. "Indeed, but myths, Watson, have a peculiar way of becoming real when the right minds are involved. We must stop them before their delusions become a deadly reality." The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the quiet room, marking the passage of time, each second pushing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Holmes looked up at Watson, his face set with determination. "It is time to act. We must go to the old mill." The mill, situated on the outskirts of London, stood in eerie silence as the two men arrived, the evening sun sinking behind it in a dull haze. The structure was dilapidated, its wooden beams creaking in the wind as if groaning under the weight of its age. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the sound of the distant river flowing over rocks punctuating the otherwise oppressive stillness. Holmes and Watson approached cautiously, their footsteps muted by the overgrown grass. As they neared the mill, Holmes's eyes scanned the area, his senses alert for any sign of movement. They were close, too close for comfort, and Holmes knew that the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. "Stay alert, Watson," Holmes muttered under his breath. This is where it all comes together. They reached the entrance of the mill, its door hanging loosely on one hinge, a dark void beyond. Holmes stepped forward, his hand brushing the door gently as it creaked open. The interior of the mill was dim, lit only by the dying light of the evening. Dust floated in the air, and the heavy scent of damp wood and mildew filled their lungs. But Holmes was not distracted by the surroundings. His eyes were fixed on a single point, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, their back to the door. "Professor Johnson," Holmes called, his voice steady and commanding. The figure turned slowly, revealing the professor, his face haggard and wild-eyed. His clothes were dishevelled, and there was a manic energy about him that was both unsettling and dangerous. "Mr. Holmes," the professor said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I knew you would come. You are far too curious for your own good." Holmes didn't flinch. "And you, Professor, are far too driven by ambition to see the danger in your actions. You and your accomplice are the ones behind the theft. The formula is not a means to eternal life, but a dangerous fantasy, one that will only lead to destruction." Professor Johnson laughed, the sound hollow and brittle, echoing through the empty mill. "You cannot understand, Holmes. The formula holds the key to everything. With it, I can achieve what no man before me ever could. Immortality." He stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with fervour. "You cannot stop me now." Holmes's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Concern, perhaps, or pity. "I can stop you, Professor, but not for your sake, for the sake of all those who would suffer because of your delusions." As the professor took a step forward, Holmes's hand moved to his coat, where a small vial of the mysterious substance they had found earlier rested. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but the situation had left him with no other choice. The mill was an ominous place, its decaying walls and broken windows casting eerie shadows over the two men standing in the dim light. The river, swollen from recent rains, rushed past with a muted roar, adding to the sense of isolation that clung to the air. The very atmosphere seemed to throb with anticipation, as though the land itself was waiting for something catastrophic to unfold. Holmes stood motionless, his eyes never leaving Professor Johnson, whose wild expression reflected a dangerous obsession. For a moment, the silence between them was suffocating, thick with tension. The professor's breath was ragged, his hands trembling as he clutched something tightly in his palm. A small vial, similar to the one Holmes had found in the Ravenscroft study. The light from the dying sun flickered against the professor's face, casting his features in sharp contrast, revealing the fevered gleam in his eyes. "Holmes," the professor rasped, his voice brittle and desperate. "You don't understand. The formula is not just a tool for wealth or power. It is the culmination of a lifetime of work, my work. I have seen what it can do, what it will do, if only I can complete it. Immortality is within my grasp." Holmes took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes fixed on the vial in the professor's hand. "You are a man consumed by your own delusions, Johnson," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of warning. "The formula is incomplete. It can never give you what you seek. Your obsession will be your undoing." The professor's eyes flashed with fury. "You don't understand, Holmes. I have been to the very edge of life and death, and I have seen the truth. This formula will unlock the greatest secret of all. I cannot, will not, let it slip through my fingers." Holmes's gaze was unflinching, his posture relaxed yet ready for action. "You may think you understand, Professor, but you are blind to the danger you are courting. The formula was never meant to be completed. It was a failed experiment, a mistake." Professor Johnson's laughter rang out, bitter and wild, echoing in the hollow space of the mill. "A mistake? You dare call it a mistake? Your mind is too narrow, Holmes. You cannot comprehend the vastness of what this formula can achieve, the power it holds. I will finish it, with or without you." Holmes's hand moved slowly to his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the small vial he had been carrying. the vial that contained the mysterious chemical from the Ravenscroft study. Holmes had suspected that it was more than just a curious substance. It was a key, a potential antidote to the dangerous alchemical brew Johnson had become so obsessed with. "Professor," Holmes said, his voice calm, almost regretful, "you leave me no choice." The professor's eyes flickered with alarm, but it was too late. Holmes, with a swift motion, pulled the vial from his coat and tossed it onto the floor between them. The vial shattered instantly, its contents spilling across the ground in a thin stream. The liquid hissed as it made contact with the dust of the mill, an acrid smell rising in the air. For a moment the professor froze, his wide eyes locked onto the spreading liquid, his body trembling as the chemical reaction began. He looked down at the vial in his hand, then back at Holmes with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "What have you done?" Johnson gasped, his voice breaking. Holmes's expression was unyielding. "I have stopped you, Professor. You've been blinded by your obsession, but this—" He gestured to the chemical spill. "This will neutralize whatever dangerous concoction you were attempting to complete. The formula is incomplete, and it must remain so." The professor's hands shook violently, and he stepped back, his eyes darting to the door, his mind racing for an escape. "No! No! You don't understand!" His voice was frantic now, rising in pitch as panic took hold. "I was so close. I could feel it, Holmes. The power was within my reach." Holmes did not flinch. "And you would have destroyed yourself and everyone around you in the process. Immortality is not a gift, Professor. It is a curse." The professor took another step back, his face contorted in rage. "You think you've won? That this little trick will stop me?" He raised the vial in his hand, his grip tight. "I will finish what I started. You cannot stop me, Holmes. You cannot understand what is at stake." Holmes's voice cut through the professor's hysteria like a sharp blade. "I do understand, Johnson. That is why I am stopping you." The professor lunged forward, his movements desperate and reckless, but Holmes was ready. In a single, fluid motion, Holmes stepped aside, and with a swift strike, he knocked the vial from the professor's hand. It shattered on the floor with a sharp crack, the liquid spilling harmlessly into the dirt. For a brief moment, the two men stood facing each other, the air heavy with the lingering tension of their confrontation. The professor's eyes were wild, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Holmes remained calm, his gaze unwavering, his posture poised and controlled. It was clear to both men that this was the point of no return. "You are finished, Professor," Holmes said quietly, his voice now low and final. "This ends now." The professor stood still, his body trembling with the weight of his failure. He looked down at the shattered vials, then back at Holmes, his face pale, his expression one of bitter defeat. For the first time since they had entered the mill, there was a flicker of clarity in his eyes, perhaps the first moment of realization that his pursuit of immortality had led him into a trap of his own making. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, he staggered backward, his body collapsing against one of the wooden beams of the mill, his face pale and hollow. Holmes approached him cautiously, his steps slow but deliberate. "Take him into custody, Watson," Holmes said quietly, turning toward his companion. "The danger has passed, but his fate is sealed." Watson, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, moved forward at once, his hand resting on the professor's shoulder as he knelt beside him. "Professor Johnson," Watson said, his voice firm but sympathetic, "you are under arrest for the theft of the formula and for endangering countless lives." The professor looked up at Watson, his eyes empty. "It was too late," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "I saw it. The power. I was so close." Holmes shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Close to what, Professor? Destruction? Delusion?" As Watson led the professor away, Holmes stood motionless, staring at the floor of the mill, where the last vestiges of the shattered vials lay. The danger had been averted, but the implications of the formula's power still loomed in his mind. For a moment, There was silence, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Holmes stood there, alone with his thoughts, as the weight of the mystery slowly began to settle. He had solved the case, but he knew that the true cost of the professor's obsession had yet to be fully understood. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the curtains of Holmes's study, casting long, pale beams across the room. The fire that had once crackled fiercely was now reduced to a mere whisper of warmth, the embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Sherlock Holmes sat at his desk, his hands folded before him, his gaze fixed on the still, quiet room. The case was over, the mystery unravelled, yet the satisfaction of its resolution seemed oddly distant, as though something remained unsettled in the air. Dr. John Watson sat across from him, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. His brow furrowed as he surveyed Holmes, who had been unusually pensive since their return from the mill. Watson, ever the keen observer, could see the tension still present in his friend's posture, though Holmes's exterior remained as composed as ever. "Well, Holmes," Watson began, breaking the silence, "another case solved, another dark chapter closed. But, if I may say, you seem distant. Does the resolution not bring you any satisfaction?" Holmes's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair, the subtle tension in his body betraying the calm expression on his face. He exhaled slowly, his gaze turning to the window as the sunlight bathed the room in warmth. "Satisfaction?" he echoed, almost to himself. "Perhaps. But it is not the resolution itself that I find troubling, Watson. It is the nature of the obsession that led to this conclusion. Professor Johnson was not merely seeking knowledge or wealth, he sought immortality, a goal so powerful and consuming that it blinded him to all else." Watson set his tea down on the table, his gaze sharp. "The professor was consumed by his ambition, it's true. But Holmes, you stopped him. You saved him, though perhaps not from himself. And the formula, it was never going to work, was it?" Holmes turned his gaze toward Watson, his expression thoughtful. "No, Watson. The formula was incomplete, its failure inevitable. But Johnson's obsession led him to believe that it could grant him the very thing he desired most. His inability to see the truth is what led him down a path of self-destruction." There was a pause, the weight of Holmes's words settling over the room like a fog. Watson leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening with a touch of empathy. "And yet, there is something tragic in that, isn't there? The sheer force of his belief in something so false. It's a reminder, I suppose, that some people are willing to sacrifice everything for the promise of something impossible." Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Yes. And that is what makes this case so unsettling. Johnson was not driven by malice, nor by greed, but by a vision, distorted by his own mind. A vision that ultimately became his undoing." The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted their conversation, and the door to the study opened to reveal Inspector Lestrade, his face grim but relieved. "Holmes, Watson," he began, stepping into the room with a solemn expression. "Professor Johnson has been arrested and charged with the theft of the formula and the endangerment of lives. His trial will begin shortly." Lestrade paused, his gaze flicking to Holmes with a mixture of respect and concern. "I must admit, Holmes, when I first heard about this case, I didn't think you'd solve it. The nature of the theft, the secrecy surrounding the formula, it all seemed too complicated. But you were right, as always." Holmes gave a slight nod, his face unreadable. "The formula was never the true object of interest, Lestrade. The real crime was in the pursuit of something unattainable, something that could only destroy the very person who sought it. Johnson's obsession blinded him to that simple truth." Lestrade's expression softened slightly. "And yet, you've brought an end to it. The formula is safe, the thief caught. It's a job well done." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he studied Lestrade for a moment before replying. "Yes. But what of the larger implications, Inspector? The formula's allure, its promise of immortality, was a force so strong that even the professor, with all his intellect, was unable to resist it. What if others, more dangerous minds, seek it as well? Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond to Holmes's question. You think there are others, then? I don't think, Inspector. Holmes replied quietly, his voice steady. I know. Watson, who had been listening intently, now spoke, his voice thoughtful. So you believe this is just the beginning? That the danger has not yet passed? Holmes's gaze darkened, his brow furrowing slightly as he spoke. The formula was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, Watson. There are those who believe that immortality is the ultimate prize, a belief so powerful that it can warp the very fabric of reality. We've seen it in Johnson's case, and we will see it again. People like him are not easily deterred. Lestrade looked from Holmes to Watson, his expression one of confusion. Are you saying, Holmes, that there's a danger out there, still lurking? That this formula or others like it could lead to more thefts, more danger? Holmes stood and walked over to the window, gazing out at the city as the first rays of daylight illuminated the streets below. Perhaps, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. Perhaps it's not the formula itself that poses the danger, but the belief that such power can be contained, controlled, or even attained. He turned back to face the room, his sharp eyes locking onto Lestrade's. The pursuit of immortality is a dangerous thing, Inspector. And if we are not vigilant, if we do not watch closely, we may find ourselves caught in the web of those who seek it, those who believe that it is worth any cost. Lestrade said nothing, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He turned toward the door, ready to leave but clearly weighed down by the thoughts Holmes had laid before him. Well, Watson said, standing up and stretching his arms, it's not often I leave one of your cases with more questions than answers, Holmes. But I suppose that's the nature of these things. Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Indeed, Watson. But it is the questions, the mysteries that remain, that make our work worthwhile. The door closed softly behind Lestrade as he left, leaving Holmes and Watson alone once more in the quiet of the study. Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the window, his mind clearly still immersed in the complexities of the case, as though searching for the next thread to follow in the tangled web of human desire. Holmes, Watson said, breaking the silence, do you ever wonder if we will ever truly know all the answers? Holmes turned his gaze toward Watson, his expression unreadable. No, Watson, and that is exactly why we continue, because the answers, elusive as they may be, are what keep us moving forward. The two men stood in silence, the weight of the case settling around them. The mystery was solved, but the world outside, full of questions and dangers yet to be revealed, remained as vast and uncertain as ever.